household micro-behavior, why weren't they realizing that something was going on with debt? And the key reason here is that I think people made it a shortcut that was not that, like if you think about it now, it wasn't that innocent with the benefit of hindsight, but it was not outrageous. The shortcut was essentially to assume that what matters is household net worth for spending, for financial decisions. So there wouldn't be a difference in that shortcut between a household that has 50,000 euros in the bank and a household that has assets of $1 million, debt of $1 million and assets of $1,050,000. Right, so they would just take this together and both have the same net, both are the same net worth households, and they were expected to behave very much the same way in macro terms. Okay, we found out now that that's not the case. And I think this is the bigger, the greater construction side. Still, like if you come across models that actually arrive at sort of a reasonable gross positions on the household balance sheet and can explain them, I'd be very interesting to hear that. But the result, the upshot of all of that was that when we started this research, there was very little in terms of long-run trends in debt, very little information on household debt, on bank lending and its composition. And we've spent sort of the better part of the last decade in filling a lot of gaps there. What we ended up with is something that I sort of would recommend you to take a look at, which is a database that has, it's again a debt also to INET that helped fund this database that's out there in the internet that contains for 17 advanced economies since 1870, so almost 150 years. I think most of the macro variables that you would be interested in. It has not only GDP, consumption, it has household debts, it has the breakdown of debt in mortgage lending and non-mortgage lending and aggregate debts, it has interest rates, short-term and long-term, it has investment, consumption, and I promise you it has very few gaps. So this is sort of the universe of macroeconomic data, macro-financial data that we have for the long run and that's out there and free for you and for you to use. And you don't need to send an email to anyone. You can just download the data and go there. So what do these long-run data show? Well, first of all, that's also the title of the talk, The Great Leverage. Inside what's been happening is that private debt, sort of debt, household credit, lending to households, or debt of the household or the non-financial private sector has grown very strongly. So to the question of the panel here, is it the public debt side or the private debt side? The long-run data give a very simple answer, a very straightforward answer, which is that it's been mostly the debt growth has been on the private side. That's the red line here in that chart. And you see that in the second half of the 20th century, there's this very strong, like almost like hockey stick-like increase in this is bank lending to the non-financial private sector. This is to companies and households. The next step, we sort of drilled deeper and asked what's behind that increase in private debt. And I think Steve has mentioned it and Ursula as well, and will be like nicely complementary, is again, it's the red line. It's mortgage lending that has been driving that sort of secular rise in debt levels in Western economies. Maybe I shouldn't say Western, I should say advanced economies. So Japan and is in the data set as well. You might say, like, look at the blue dotted line. That's non-mortgage lending. That's essentially business. That's essentially bank lending to business. That's your textbook model of what banks are supposed to do, collect deposits from households and then lend them on to businesses. And if you zoom in just on the just look at the 1910 level, you'll see, like, on average, bank lending to business, to GDP is maybe around 50% on the eve of World War I. If you jump forward like 70 years to 2000, 2005, we're maybe at 55, 60%. But you can easily say that in a century, not much has happened to the side of bank lending to the corporate sector. All the action has been on the mortgage side. And that's what we do. In a table here, far too many figures. The point of this table is just to show you, look with me at the bottom two lines. The table details the increase in bank lending to GDP ratios over the past 50 years. and tells you what share of the increases come from real estate, from unsecured lending, from lending to households and lending to business. And the story is very clear. The big rise in debt levels and lending to the private sector has come from lending to households for the purpose of real estate financing. Yeah, so it's really like the elephant in the room is real estate debt, is mortgage debt. Of the total increase has been around 80 percentage points of GDP, and 71%, more than 70% of that increase has come from real estate lending to households. I think that's what we know. If you want to explain what's going on here, there's a next frontier. And I think that next frontier is exactly what Ursula already started our panel with. It is to go to microdata. Because if we want to say something about how the distribution of debt has changed, how the interaction of asset prices and lending is what Stevens talked about, if we really want to drill down and be able to say with some certainty, we understand what's going on here, we need to have household level information to have a closer, or to have a better understanding of what's going on. The macro data will just get us this far, and there will be always a lot of stories that we can tell with this macro data, but I think we all want to get a little bit more closer. So let me take my last 5 minutes to briefly run you through 3 applications of a new micro data set that we've put together. Which connects perfectly with Ursula's work, because she uses the Survey of Consumer Finances that you can download from the Fed, that starts in 1983. What we found in the data archives of the University of Michigan were historical waves of that Survey of Consumer Finances, going back all the way to 1948. And those of you who don't know the Survey of Consumer Finances, that's a representative survey of the American population, so this is going to be only US data now, that covers everything you want to know about household financial positions: assets, debt, and income, and a lot of demographic characteristics. So if you're interested in the question of debt and race, gender, it's all in there. Yeah. So we coded these historical surveys going back, and the first question we asked ourselves is, Ursula referred to it, has the distribution of debt changed? So is there a tendency in the American economy over the past 70 years that poor people owe more debt? You all have Raghuram Rajan's story, I think, still present, which links increasing inequality to debt accumulation. Is there something in the data that tells us the distribution of debt has changed over time in a major way? So here's the first chart. It shows you just the total debt outstanding in the U.S. economy, household debt outstanding in the U.S. economy, and what share of that total debt is owed by different income quintiles. So you have the incomes, the smallest 20%, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, and greater than 80. And just look with me kind of at the overall pattern of the data. There isn't a great change, like something like that jumps out of you, out of the data jumps at you in terms of changing distribution of debt. Yeah, rich households owe the largest share, and those shares have remained roughly stable. But what about debt-to-income ratios? We know that the income distribution has become more skewed, so rich people, the richer parts have higher incomes. Has there been a big change in debt-to-income ratios? And this chart breaks it even down into 2 components, the housing debt and non-housing debt. And again, debt-to-income ratios have risen in America. They've risen across the income distribution. Yeah? But it's hard, and maybe there's been a little bit more of an increase of non-housing debt, and this is part of the student loan issue on the sort of for low-income households. But overall, same story here. Not a big shift in the distribution of debt over time. The next question, maybe the most interesting, before I come to fragility, is has the life cycle profile of debt changed? Have households over time changed their behavior? What we can do with these long-run data is we can construct cohorts, and we can follow birth cohorts over time. What you see here are the different birth cohorts over time. That's the age when we start tracking them, 30, 35, 65, for these different birth years. And you see that's in 10-year intervals. And if you look at the lowest line, that's the cohort of Americans born between with the circles, starting at 0.4 on the very left-hand side. That's the birth cohort of Americans born between 1915 and 1924. And you see a classical hump-shaped pattern. Yeah? They start at the age of 35 with some debt accumulation, then it goes up over lifetime, and then they reduce it over time when they go into retirement. And now you see, like, going through generations of Americans, how that cohort time profile has changed over time. And there are two important insights here. One is, yes, people start originally with higher debt levels, but maybe even more interestingly, the life cycle profile has shifted. Just look at the older cohorts of Americans. People are 65 now, and they're no longer reducing their debt. And that's one of the key insights that comes out of these microdata, is that today, unlike before, Americans die with a lot of debt. Or you can say, banks in America give 30-year mortgages to people who are 70 and 75 years old. Yeah, there's no reduction down the life cycle. The last point what we can do with these microdata is we can stress test household balance sheets, and we can see which parts of the population are particularly vulnerable to asset price fluctuations. This here just shows you how big the losses are in $1 million to a 10, 20, 30% drop in house prices. Remember, there's been all this increase in leverage against house prices, so the effects of house price fluctuations are magnified. And if we drill down to who are the most vulnerable groups, I think that's very compatible with what Ursula said before. It's mainly, most of the leverage sits in the middle classes. But you see that here, in percent of aggregate income in response to a 20% house price drop, the negative home equity in the system, sort of really the losses of individual households are up to 10%, up to 12% actually of that aggregate income group. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.